We have an awesome guest today. We're going to call this the Kermit the Frog episode because I woke up this morning and I think I'm losing my voice, and Ed's just getting over being sick. So we're going to power through. I feel pretty good, but my voice does not sound great. So I'm so grateful that you're all here. Listen, I want to welcome you to the Best Places to Lead show. I am your host, Jerry McNamara, and so glad that you're here, or you decided to press play, or if you're catching the podcast episode after the fact. Listen, we're on a mission. We're going to positively impact 5 million people over the next 5 years through better business. And we're closing out 2022. So year one of the mission is almost complete. Here's the point. I have never, ever met anyone who showed up to work and said, you know what, I really want to suck today. And yet so many people are ineffective and disengaged. It's not their fault. It's our fault as the leader. We have to create that environment for people to thrive. And that's why we're here today, so that we can learn from each other. We're always better together. So we're trying to create compelling companies that outperform. And here's the trick, right? If we have success without fulfillment, it's the greatest ripoff in life. So let's make sure that our leaders get home for dinner so they can spend time with their families. That's what's super important. So if you're good at home, you can be great at work. And if you're good at work, you can be great at home. So we look at all of our people as whole people, and it's super important that we do that. So I want to thank so many people who are here today. Bill Holmes, super fan. He's here almost every week, even from Alaska. He's here today. Ashlyn Jansen is here. Good to see you. Thanks for coming. Amanda Coomer, Andrew Broger. It was nice to meet you on LinkedIn. I love the story, and we're sending all sorts of positive vibes into the universe for sure. Carolyn Slover. Ed's wife is here, and I love that. I always get emotional when my wife shows up and has time to be here on the show because I love her support. Connie Shoemaker, Ed's mom, is here. Now, Connie, that's amazing because I lost my mom 2 years ago, and she was always my biggest cheerleader. So thank you for being here. Craig Besky, my longest standing friend, 30 years I've known this kid, and he still puts up with me. So I'm so glad all of you are here. Saul, Vincent, thanks for coming in. Since this is your first time, we don't stand on ceremony around here. If you have questions, put them in the chat. Tell us where you're tuning in from, right? We'd love to know where you're coming from. And as we go through this, if you have questions, you can put it in the chat. We'll bring you on if you want to ask the question yourself, or I'll ask it for you. But the whole idea is we're better together. And so let's get started. So I love this because I met Dr. Ed, I guess it's about 2 months ago, and the world and the universe has been conspiring against us. So I was going to be on Dr. Ed's podcast, and Hurricane Ian knocked us off the line. We finally got it rescheduled. And then Ed was going to be on this podcast about a month ago, and Zoom was down. And so I don't know why the universe was conspiring against us. I guess they didn't want too much genius in the room at the same time. But I am so glad you're here. So let me give you the introduction of Ed. Right, university professor, practitioner, is CEO of Quest4Life training consulting company. This was something I did not know about you when I was doing my research. Associate editor of the International Journal of Responsible Leadership and Ethical Decision-Making. The idea that we have to have ethical decision-making and responsible leadership, those qualifiers in front of leadership and decision-making, that's a little mind-blowing to me, but nonetheless, it is what it is, right? And so I asked Ed to join because he's one of the most researched, thoughtful, and developed thinkers on the topic of leadership. And that's saying something because I consider myself in that same way, but he blows me away. And so considerable expertise, doctor of management and organizational leadership, master's of science in psychology, life transformation coach. He's the reason you're here. So Ed, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Jerry. Glad to be here.
Yeah, man. I want to talk about relationships because when we spoke before, I thought it was really, really interesting, the conversation we had. And we talked about conversations are the currency of relationships. So how do you develop great conversations?
Well, let me provide a little bit of context around conversation being the currency of relationships. I'm a firm believer that the conversation is the relationship and defines the nature of the relationship. So when you and I spoke previously, the first example I gave you was, imagine you end up going to the grocery store every week at roughly the same time on the same day. That's typically what most people do. And we end up going through the same checkout line and meeting up with the employee there. And we recognize them and they recognize us over a period of time. And a conversation starts. And it's largely superficial. I mean, there's really no breadth and depth to it. Maybe it's about the weather or it's about holiday season or something, but it is a conversation. And we would define that quote relationship as an acquaintance, but it is technically a relationship. The relationship just happens to be really pretty narrow and pretty shallow. Now, if you imagine the people in your life that you have the most emotionally intimate relationship with, start to consider what are those things that you're actually talking about. The breadth and depth of those conversations are vastly different than the person you see at the grocery store. And so if you want to assess the quality of your relationship, you really have to assess the quality of the conversations you're having with the people that you're in relationships with. So going to your question about how do you have those meaningful conversations, context matters. So it depends on ultimately who it is that you're speaking with. Now, as a dad, nothing's off the table with my children. Nothing's taboo. We talk about everything, even if it makes them a little bit uncomfortable, depending on the topic. We have 2 teenage girls, and so you might imagine what some of those are like. And it's operating in this space of being open, honest, and transparent, and letting that be okay. Letting the truth be enough because the truth is stubborn. And then you transition that maybe to a spouse, significant other, or partner. Now, typically you would have the breadth and depth of those conversations, pretty significantly wide and deep. And then we move into the business context. How we engage with our manager is different than how we'll engage with coworkers. It's different if we are managers, how we'll engage with other managers and those people that report to us. Fundamentally, though, the how part of it is we need to meet people where they are, especially if we're their leader or manager. We need to figure out where they are and meet them in that space rather than having them flex their particular communication style to fit us. And that's extraordinarily challenging because baked into the cake, you have this thing called power asymmetry. And most leaders don't recognize this. Most followers or most direct reports absolutely recognize that there's a disproportionate power dynamic going on. And then depending on how the leader or manager goes about leading and managing, that asymmetry or that perceived distance between the manager and the follower becomes really uncomfortable for the follower. We, at least in the United States, we generally don't like an unequal distribution of power. And so the most effective leaders are able to close that distance, create some type of symmetry here, all the while knowing that it's never going to be perfectly symmetrical. But they're able to make it more symmetrical than not, thereby being able to relate better to the follower and where that follower currently is.
Oh, good. And I have like 6 follow-up questions, so I'm going to try and contain myself. Let me start with my first one. First of all, I was laughing because I was thinking about my own grocery shopping habits. And I love that on Sunday you send me your podcast because I will listen to it while I'm shopping in Publix because I am that creature of habit. Leading and managing people is about psychology, right?
Yes.
And so you're talking about leading people on their terms and not your own. And I think about this as leadership agility and being curious as a person and as a human being, because I think the best leaders are curious people. But here's my question, right? Because people want consistency. What's good for them better be good for me. How do you manage that where you apply consistency, but you have individual relationships in different places where people need help or need more support? How do you do that without breaking that trust where it's like, oh, Ed has a favorite and I know it's Saul because I saw him, he was on the podcast with Ed.
Yeah. So I want to go a couple directions with this. The first, and whenever I was in management positions, I would actually communicate transparently with my team on the first part of this. And that is, I'm going to treat everybody the same and I'm going to treat everybody differently. And I'm not a person that likes talking out of both sides of my mouth, but here's what I mean. I'm going to treat everybody the same in the sense that I'm going to treat everybody consistently and fairly to make sure that they have all the training and development opportunities, that are available or made available by the organization. I'm going to put them in the best position to win. Excuse me. In terms of labor law, I'm going to make sure to adhere to labor law and make sure that standard's met. So in that case, I'm not going to discriminate. I'm going to treat everybody the same. However, because everyone is uniquely different and how they show up, personality-wise or temperament-wise, how they show up is uniquely different. I need to spend enough time getting to know each person and truly meet them where they are and give them the attention that they need, or give them the opportunities they need to grow in order to, progress their career. Because the prerequisite for leadership is that you have to have a willing follower. You have to have someone that will willingly do that. But the number one job of any leader is to make their followers better at their job. That's why we're in the positions that we are. And when we're able to do that person by person, that ultimately rolls up into the team being successful, the department being successful, and then the organization being successful as a whole.
I think that's so good. I have this whole concept about the 4 C's, right? If you want to keep your employees really engaged, and you better have clarity of how they win. They better be challenged by the work that they do. Comfortable that, as I say from Captain Rick Hoffman, the tools, time, and training to be successful. And are they cared about as in a person in your care, right? And I think that comes back to the only way you can care about your people is to get to know them as individuals, to know that, hey, Connie's on the call. That's amazing. I think that's awesome. You have 2 teenage daughters and you can ask, hey, how was the soccer match this weekend? How did that go? Right. Mm-hmm. And when we miss on that, I think that's when, we come back to it. People don't quit their job. They quit their leader. And that's so, right. One of the core tenets is, how do you build these world-class relationships? And, as you're saying, your number one job is to make them better at their job. And the only way you can do that is to know them as a person, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, to chart that path forward. Any tips on ways in which you've done that in the past? Like, I think there's some people that view relationships as transactions. I know you're not one of those people. Yeah. But if someone has been typically transactional in their approach, how do you get them to move into this space of transformation? We're all getting better. We're making people better at their job. And that's what our role is.
It's extraordinarily difficult. Going back to care really quickly, what if some leaders don't? And that's obviously a massive challenge. The other dynamic to this is it's more difficult than not to care when we have personality mismatch with the people that that are following us. And so how we go about really bridging that gap is to find common ground and spend enough time with them to learn what it is that blows their hair back. What is it that motivates them? What is the something that they can get behind every day to perform at a high level? As leaders, Jerry, what we like to think is that our employees will just automatically align with the mission and vision, and they're just going to be crazy passionate about all of that. And that's not always the case. But they can be really high-performing employees that are committed to their job and committed to their coworkers and committed to the cause, even if the cause isn't the focal point or that key motivating thing. Yeah. But there's something, and we need to spend enough time with these folks to learn what that something is. And maybe that something is a sense of pride that they feel watching their kids open Christmas gifts on Christmas morning, or making the last tuition payment on their child's college. I mean, their work afforded them the opportunity to have that sense of pride. That's the something that connects it back. And if we spend enough time, all the while trying to find common ground, especially if there's a personality mismatch, we have at least the seedlings to move from transactional to transformational, because we can coach to those things. Yeah. And we can pull things out of people's blind spots that might be limiting them. And I'm not even suggesting limiting in terms of them getting promoted, just in terms of becoming a better version of themselves with regard to how they show up.
It's interesting you're your take on this because it's a little bit different than mine. And so I want to dig into that just a little bit. When I think about creating compelling companies, I always say there's three ways you can do it. People either align on the vision, the impact that you want to go make. They align on the values, how I feel, the people that I'm around. It feels great to be here, or their position. Like I love sales, but I really love B2B SaaS sales. The trick is if you really want to have a great compelling company, you have people that align on all three.
That's right.
Right. And so, you're suggesting that, for some people, they don't have to align and yet they can still be a contributor into the business. Is it your job as a leader to get them to a place where it sets their soul on fire? Or is it okay? Is it enough to just allow them to be in their why and contribute to the organization? How do you reconcile that?
I think the ideal is the former. I think it's fairly self-evident that if employees don't align with the mission and vision, they're not going to be there very long, or they're going to feel completely disconnected from the organization.
That's right.
So I think it's fairly obvious. So they have to be invested in the mission and vision enough. But what I'm asserting is that doesn't necessarily need to be the primary motivator, for someone. Now, because you've got different buckets of employees, and to your point, we want people that are highly motivated and highly satisfied, and they'll run through walls for it. But we also know, just practically speaking, that we have employees that are highly motivated and completely dissatisfied, or they're unmotivated but completely satisfied. Those are somewhat rare, but that happens. And then you have negative on each of those. And I think as leaders, what we need to be able to do is be flexible enough to navigate the individual people to say, hey, look, I know the mission and vision isn't necessarily front and center, but I know that you value your position, you value the relationships, you value what this affords to you. So for example, my wife works for a waste management company. And I can only imagine, and I don't know this definitively, but I can only imagine that there are workers in garbage trucks that have been doing it for 20, 30 years, and they aren't necessarily motivated to get promoted or to move up to the next level. They might even be marginally dissatisfied with that, but they're extraordinarily loyal and committed to doing it well. So I think that it really is a blend, and it's up to the leader to flex their style to the individual.
I think you're right. I had this conversation with one of my leaders a number of years ago, and we were talking about we need all A players. And in his mind, A players were the people that were the hard drivers and wanted to get promoted. And I said, that's not necessarily the case. There's people in life circumstances that are, I don't know, maybe their spouse travels a lot, and this is a way for them to contribute to the family, but they're not trying to get promoted because their family logistics don't offer that. That's not what they want. And yet they can still be incredibly effective for you as a person. They can still be that A player inside the company. I do find that interesting of like, where is that blend of allowing people in your care to not be engaged, to not feel connected, yet they might be doing a good job and filling a cog in the wheel for you, and your responsibility to get them to a better place, right?
I think from a leadership perspective, I think the pursuit is ongoing. I don't think we should dismiss anyone, if we've identified or even misapplied our judgment to someone who says, you're not overly engaged here. Well, I'm just not going to give you a whole bunch of attention. It's like, no, I'm going to give you the attention you deserve, because it's my job to make you better at your job. However, I need to do this. Here's where I think the magic happens with leadership, is that leadership is relational. And if you go back to what I said earlier, it doesn't exist without willing followership. So if you have a follower that over time believes that their leader has their best interest in mind, they'll start to trust the leader. And once trust is established, they'll commit to the leader. They may not commit to the logo or the brand, but they're going to commit to that person. Right. And when that person sets direction or sort of a micro vision that lines up with the overall mission and vision of the organization, that's when leadership really pops. One of the challenges, though, is the whole flexing of the style piece, because whether we want to admit it or not, one of the most difficult psychologies to reconcile is success bias. So you ascend to a certain level, and clearly how you went about doing that got you to that level, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to make you effective leading and managing, the levels below you where you once were. So we become biased to that, and it comes off very much as like, Jerry, just do it this way, do it my way. I know best. I know better. And that's antithetical to meeting the follower where they are.
Yes.
And then it's just like, okay, what do we do with that as a follower? Because that's not cultivating trust, certainly not cultivating commitment. It's like, well, my manager told me to do it this way. I'll do it this way. I'm not inspired to do it this way, but I'll do it. And just to make sure that I keep them off my back. And where this gets really messy is if I lose trust in you as my leader, I'm not going to talk to you as much. I'm not going to share as much information. And what that's going to do is that's going to compromise your ability to make better decisions. And so you can see how this can go into a positive feedback loop or a negative feedback loop really, really quickly, depending on the nature of the conversations that you're having with, between manager and follower.
All right. So I think about success bias, and Tom Vranis and I talked about this. I don't know, Tom was maybe episode 20 or so. The way in which we used to lead 15 years ago is not possible to lead today, right? And so, the whole idea of command and control, you're lucky to have a job, shut up, listen, learn, go do your work, which literally my earliest mentor told me those things exactly every day: shut up, listen, and learn. But we had amazing trust. So I blindly followed him in doing that. I think it is interesting in today's day and age. One of my core sayings that I say every morning to remind myself is to live in wonder, not in judgment. Because I'm trying to suspend, hey, that's a dumb idea, right? Or, hey, that's not going to work because it didn't work for me. That whole idea of a success bias. Any other tips for you? I mean, I have to remind myself of it every day. I literally do it in my morning intentions: to live in wonder, not in judgment. How do you get leaders to suspend that success bias so that they can build the relationship? Or is it as simple as be curious about your people, give a shit about them, care about them, and everything else falls into place?
I think in reality, it's fundamentally that simple, but that really falls under the header of simple but not easy.
Yeah, for sure.
Right, because we have to get out of our own way, and that's our ego gets trapped in this bubble wrap of our ego, and it's really uncomfortable to move beyond that, because we have to make some type of admission to ourselves that how we're going about doing whatever it is we're doing is less than effective. We have to have the willingness to be able to look at it, and B, have the courage to say, you know what, however I'm doing this it's not necessarily wrong, but it's ineffective, and it could be way better. And who's the common denominator in this relationship? Because if I've got three employees or three followers where their performance is lacking, I'm the common denominator in each of those.
Yeah.
So it really does take quite a little bit of courage to kind of stare at it and talk your ego down and get out of the way and come at it with humility. Come at it from a position of learning and curiosity rather than criticism or judgment.
Yeah, I think it's so good, right? Ego is the Enemy is one of my favorite books by Ryan Holiday.
Yeah.
Every person should read that book. I think about something I call the leadership quicksand, because and it's like applicable here because you're hitting on it again and again, right? So the way I explain it is a lack of clarity leads to confusion. Confusion leads to frustration. Frustration leads to a break in trust, which means you have poor relationships, and then therefore less stuff gets done because we don't have the equity in the relationships. And so it's not them, it's us. It always comes back to us. Walk me through this, because I want to roll back up to
Can I interject something, Jerry, just real quick?
Yeah, of course, do it.
One of the common misconceptions in any relationship is that it's 50-50. And that's really easy to fall into. It's just like you and I have a relationship. We have a growing friendship. You're 50% of it. I'm 50% of it. That's just how that is. And that's exactly wrong. I am 100% responsible for me in our relationship. You're 100% responsible for you in our relationship and how we go about showing up in that space. So I think that's an important thing to note whenever leaders, sort of get caught up in the frustration, this Bermuda Triangle of, well, they should have done this or they should have thought of that. And it's like, no, that's not how that is. If there's any confusion around any of this, it's up to the leader to help clarify that confusion. I mean, ultimately. And, I mentioned a couple of times how people show up. I think this is where a lot of leaders just don't take the time or care, or maybe they're just ignorant to it. They don't take the next step. Because whenever we see employees that might be struggling with performance, or maybe they're having behavioral issues or whatever, or resisting change, we look at that and say, well, they're lazy, or they just don't get it. They don't understand. Well, what we're describing in the moment is how that person is showing up. And a lot of times we stop there. But what gets me curious is why they're showing up that way in the first place. So take, for example, maybe you have someone right around our age that is in the workforce and we're not overly proficient with technology. And then all of a sudden we go into a meeting and our manager announces to our department that we're rolling out a software application and we're going to be doing that within the next 90 days. And here's how this is going to benefit the business, benefit you individually. Meanwhile, I'm stewing in the meeting thinking, oh my gosh, what does this mean? I'm not that technically proficient. So if I can't learn this, then is that going to expose me for not having the required skill set to have this job? And if that's the case, they're going to fire me, but I have a mortgage and all these other obligations. And the process, it happens like that. It's this neurochemical flood where we go straight from some measure of certainty to feeling completely isolated. But the steps that we go through is we went from some measure of certainty to uncertainty to anxiety. And then when you combine the two, that's fear. And then when we ask, well, what are we afraid of? Well, this is where our primitive brain takes over. Because when we used to live in tribes, if we did anything to alienate the other group members, they would kick us out. And isolation back then meant a death sentence. Our biology has not caught up to contemporary life, just like it's not caught up to food being all the time everywhere or all of this advanced technology. It just hasn't. And so now you have that person in the meeting feeling completely isolated and vulnerable. And how overwhelmingly distracting is that?
Totally.
But what about this? What about as a leader, you've taken enough time to have gotten to know this person and you have a good idea of how they show up whenever there's change, and you've spent enough time to kind of understand why they respond the way they respond. What about meeting with them before the meeting and say, hey, Jerry, I just want to give you a heads up. The organization's made a decision to move in this direction. And first off, I want to give you every assurance that I will help you and I will help you be successful with this change. Absolutely help you be successful. No matter what, I've got your back on this. But I wanted to talk to you before the meeting because I didn't want you to be overly distracted in the moment and not hear some really critical points that as to the reasons why we're rolling this out, as to all of the benefits. And then here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to go to the meeting, take notes, take down the facts, and then take the rest of the day off. And just let it wash over you, give some thought to it, distance yourself psychologically from the moment. And then let's meet tomorrow morning and check in to see how you're doing. Like, that's way different. Like, why? Let's go do something like that. So I know I riffed a little bit there, Jerry, but I wanted to make sure to make that point.
I think you're right. It just comes back to, I always come back to communication is that foundation. You started our whole, interview with that, right? Conversations, quality of the conversations have to be in the care of the people that we are and meeting them where they're at, not us
That's
where
right.
we're at. Right. And, Andrew put something good in the chat, right? Is, when he meets when I talk to managers, I get the feeling that they are important. When I talk to leaders, I get the feeling that I am important. I think that's a great shout out. And I love that, right? It's so important.
Yeah.
Here's the piece that I keep on like having 5 questions every time you talk. I had never heard of power asymmetry, right? I mean, once you said it, I was like, oh yeah, it makes total sense. I just never heard of it. And I've always been a senior leader inside companies. So I've always had positional authority, and yet I've always tried to build great relationships. And you talk about narrowing that power asymmetry. One of the things that I've done, and Maria can attest this because she's my assistant, she's here on the call, giving people explicit permission. If you don't understand something, if you're confused, if you're concerned, I give you 100% permission 100% of the time to raise your hand. In fact, I demand it. And it's just getting people to that place, because it's never occurred to me that I would be approachable because I'm the CEO, right? Because like I can talk to anyone, I can talk to the paint on the wall, you name it, I can talk to them. And so how do we help people, be aware that power asymmetry happens, right? Got it, awareness, it's out there. But the second piece is any other tips on how to narrow that for senior leaders, because it is real. Like I ran a construction company for 75 people, and I found out later that people were intimidated by me. I was like, how are you intimidated by me? I'm the nicest guy you'll ever find. So approachable. And yet, because I worked fast and I made fast decisions and was, confident, people were like, whoa, that guy is whoa. And so that was a blind spot for me. And I was appreciated that I got that piece of feedback. But how do you help leaders narrow that power asymmetry?
Let me give an example of that. The classroom setting's interesting in the sense that the teacher is technically in charge. And there's this whole theory on classroom management, but my students aren't technically my employees. In fact, they're paying me for whatever that's worth. But it's not that dissimilar in terms of perceived hierarchy. What I do on the first day of class, I'm not suggesting, in professional settings we do this necessarily. What I do in the first day in class is I introduce myself as Dr. Ed Slover. And I let them know that I've never been fully comfortable with that title. So for the rest of the semester, I respectfully request they call me Ed, Doc, or Oh Captain, my Captain. And right then it gets a laugh and it starts to cut through the uncertainty because it's day 1 of the semester. They don't know what to expect. So we have that. And then I go into this little shtick of using the contemporary language of Gen Z, like lit or fire or all of these other things. I mean, I have to go to Urban Dictionary to learn what half of them are. And it cuts through all of that. So I tell you that because later on in the semester, whenever I'm talking about power distance or power asymmetry, I ask them, how different would it have been had I come into class on the first day and said, hi, everyone, my name's Dr. Ed Slover. I've got 25 plus years of experience. You're going to sit there for the balance of the semester, take notes because what I have to say is gospel. Obviously, 2 totally different approaches. The reason I do the former is to become more relatable. One of the things that's it's throughout the leadership literature, but followers value people that are real and human and not caught up in the title and status associated with it, that are willing to say, I don't know, rather than just making something up and trying to work through it. Communicating vulnerability. Now, I'm not talking about a therapy session, but being able to communicate, vulnerably, because that takes courage and everybody knows that. And it just makes it by virtue of doing that, it reduces the the distance. It makes it more symmetrical than not. The hierarchy is going to be the way that is. You're just trying to connect with them on a different level, all the while knowing that we've got work to do. We've got to get to all of these tasks. This isn't, it's not going to be a frat party. We want to get along, but we have all this work to do. And then whenever you get back into like personality matches, another thing leaders really need to pay attention to is this whole in-group, out-group phenomenon, where it's really easy to be in with the leader if your personality just happens to match with them. And everybody that doesn't, by the way, they know that. And that actually increases the perceived asymmetry. What do we do about those folks? And this goes back to sort of circle back around to what we talked about earlier and really spending time with them, finding common ground, learning what motivates them, and then helping them.
I have a CEO that I work with, and they're extraordinary. They run an amazing company. Had to go hybrid because of remote, because of COVID. Many times have won best places to work. It's a great, great company. And they just got their feedback back from their employees. And one of the score had dropped, which they were concerned about because they take it very seriously. But one of the pieces of feedback that really irked them was that leadership is a clique, and that whole in-group, out-group. And, as we were unpacking that, it was the whole notion of disconnection, that they hadn't done a great job of keeping connected across the organization, because not only did they go remote, their business grew exponentially. I mean, a great business. And so, there were people that had never met people, and, just all of these things where it was easy to point at something and be like, oh, that's a click over there. And so, one of the strategies that we're working on is how do we foster better connection, which is really what it comes back to. Having conversations, having happy hours, making sure that we're doing team meetings at the department level, at the company level, communicating the why behind it, which we forget to do as companies grow and grow and grow. It's like, oh, forgot we actually need to bring people together and get them back on the same page. Super important, part of the process.
That's right. What do people want most in relationships? Connection.
Yes.
Which relationships? All of them. Relationship to our manager, our job, our coworkers, our spouse, our children, all of it. That's why disconnection is so terrifying and leading to feeling, even if it's not technically being isolated and alone, it's the feeling of that. And so as a leader, how do we make people in these moments, how do we help them feel less isolated? And I think drawing back to finding out whatever that something is a good starting point.
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes is, if you want to find the differences in people, you can find them. And if you want to find the commonalities, you can find them too.
That's right.
Just depending on what you're seeking. It's up to you in owning it. One of the things that we talked about was 20% of Americans are reluctant to talk to their manager. And this drives me batty, because when I think about where I get my best information inside companies, it's not the data, it's not the report, it's walking around and saying, Ashlyn, help me to understand this. What are you seeing here? And if you don't have those relationships to get those gold nuggets coming back out, you're sunk as a leader.
That's right.
And so how do we help leaders to be more approachable? And I keep on coming back to, you said this earlier, simple, not easy. I look at so much of this and I've run a number of companies. I've been super lucky to be in the right place at the right time. Running a business, in my estimation, is easy because I've done it many times and we've had some success. It's not easy for everyone. Just like it's not easy for me to snowboard. I go crash and I get hurt. And so, when you have skills, sometimes it's hard to see why it's hard for other people. And so I can tell you're a relationship-driven guy. How do you help people to become more approachable so we get 100% of people feeling comfortable that we can have dialogue and conversations, and my voice matters in all of what we're doing?
A good starting point is empathetic listening. I mean, what's the old adage? Seek first to understand, then be understood.
Yep. Stephen.
I mean, here's what we know. This is self-evident. The thing people like talking about more than anything else is themselves. What if we actually sat with someone and asked them about them, and with genuine interest? Because I mean, people feign interest all the time and the other person knows it. One of the things that I was thinking about the other week is, what if we asked someone, how are you? And we actually genuinely wanted the answer. And then taking it further, what if they actually wanted to give us a genuine answer to that? Versus, what happens every single day? It's like, how are you? Good. How you doing? Good. And we just don't care. And I understand the dynamics about that, but what if we actually sat down with someone and asked them about them, and then reflected back to them or probed further, rather than offering, advice or counsel? And Jerry, I'm the first person to admit that this is a struggle for me. I'm a solutions-oriented teacher. And it's really, really difficult to sit still in the moment and sit still and truly listen, and then ask follow-up questions. Now the type of relationship you have will dictate how you go about doing it. Where if you have a really good relationship with someone, you could probably just sit and maybe nod and not have to offer anything else except maybe a follow-up question you'll get more back. If a person maybe doesn't trust you as much, then you have to take a bit of a softer approach until you can start building that. But that stat is alarming. 20% don't talk to their managers. Plus, it makes me curious what the other 80% are talking to them about. I mean, in-group, out-group, is it task focused? Is it relationship focused? Is it cliquish? Is it not? It's not coincidental that only about a third of the U.S. workforce reports being engaged in their work. I mean, 51% report being disengaged, and the remainder, roughly 18%, report being actively disengaged. These are the people that are applying to jobs while they're at work. So it's something, it goes back to something you said at the beginning of the call, where it comes down to the leader. The onus is on the leader to bridge that gap. And I mean, we really should work, if something's not working, we really should work to repair the things that announce themselves in need of fixing. And those are way more apparent than we give credence to. We just have to be willing to look at it.
I think it's that it comes back to like conscious intention, how you're going to show up for your people. And, Bill Holmes has been through my leadership gap course, and it's all about, how am I going to show up for my people? What are the promises that I'm going to make? What are my values? What's my user manual? Like, I'm not going to make you guess. I'm going to give you the answers to the tests. Yep. Imagine if we did that for people. Like, I'm not going to make you wait 120 days to figure out something pisses me off. No, I'm going to tell you, here are the things that piss me off. And we're going to shortcut that relationship. And, I always come back to, what is the role of the leader? It's to make you do your job better, right? That's what you had said. I think about it as, my job is to create a predictable environment where people can make agile, autonomous, and engaged decisions in pursuit of the company's goals. Yeah. Because that's how you unlock next level inside everyone. Because if I trust you and I've given you, that forces me to make sure that you have clarity on what the objectives are, that you have the tools, time, and training to do it, and you create that environment. There's a next level of engagement that happens in all of these things, because, I love the book, The Art of Impossible by Stephen Kotler. Mm-hmm. Flow, peak performance, stems out of curiosity, passion, purpose, and then the keys, autonomy and mastery. I want to become great at it, and I have the runway to make decisions and do things. It's the best book that I've read probably in the last 5 years. And if you ask me which one before that, I would have what would be the best book? Maybe the Book of Joy. But, I think those are the things we get in our own way. in all of these, because what was good one day is no longer good the next day. And so people are confused. You have that leadership quicksand that just devolves into low performance. And then you think like, oh, I have the bad news bears. It's like, it's not them. It's you.
That's right.
It's you. You've missed the mark. You've missed the mark in getting people what they need to be successful.
Yeah. Who do we have the most conversations with? Ourselves. All right. Well, let's look at that kind of from a relationship fitness perspective. Everybody knows that physical activity is good for us. And when we don't engage in that, then that compromises our health. Or if we don't do those, that, and then we eat poorly or we have really negative habits, that's not that dissimilar to getting trapped in the labyrinth of our mind of negative self-talk and living out these self-limiting beliefs. Well, you can't be a better version, or you can't be better for anybody else until you're first better for yourself. And if you're living in that space, how can you possibly have someone want to willingly follow you? That just doesn't fit. But what if we were able to shift the conversations that we were having ourselves, not unlike having a shift in our physical activity, where the goal isn't perfect. The goal is incrementally better every day, whether it's through affirmations or aphorisms, something like you do every morning that kind of level sets you, where it almost is some sort of psychological shield that disallows you from going into that labyrinth. That's not unlike going outside and taking a walk, right? It's momentum in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that the key piece is like, are you a leader worth following?
Yeah.
Are you doing the work yourself? And are you worth following? Because, at the heart of it, it's like, do as I say, not as I do. I always think it's interesting, the 300-pound doctor that tells you to go on a diet. It's like, talk about lacking moral authority here. I'm not exactly sure how that works.
That's right.
Vincent has a good question. Vincent, would you like to come on, or you want me to read the question for you?
Sure, I can read it. It's when you're looking at these conversations and these relationships, how do you establish that new baseline, especially coming from the perspective that you might have made mistakes previously? How do you reset and approach the conversation moving forward and establish that new norm?
So
I have never made a mistake in my relationships, Vincent. So I'm going to yield to Ed on this one, because
neither have I. I'm just asking for a friend.
Thank you.
Vince, I'm operating under the assumption that it's changing the conversations with the same person.
Yes.
Like you were having a certain type of conversations and it wasn't going the way you wanted it to go, and now there's an opportunity to change that.
Yes.
The first thing I would suggest doing is making note of those things that serve to inhibit the effectiveness of your communication. My guess is that the communication was fully understood. The question is, was it positioned in a way that actually yielded some sort of desired effect? And if it didn't, then that obviously informs how you can shift the conversation going forward. Generally speaking, one of the ways once you establish that, one of the most effective things to do is stop talking. And this is strange because we're talking about conversations, but actually stop talking. Take a position of learning and observation, because very often people want to be seen. They certainly want to be heard, but they also want to know that they're been seen, especially whenever we're dealing with conflict, because conflict is fundamentally uncomfortable. The question is it perceived as unsafe by one or more parties involved? And if it's viewed as unsafe, the question is, what are they guarding their fear with? Does it come off as anger? Does it come off as resistance? Does it come off as, fighting back or avoidance? Maybe they just leave. So that's ultimately how they're showing up. And we'd want to know, well, there's something about my presentation that's triggering that. So I'd want to learn more as to the why piece. So that allows me to flex my style in addition to helping them reconcile whatever it is that they're going through. It's ultimately grounded in fear. But, Vince, the reality is there's no singular answer to your question. It really is very much art or much more of an art than it is a science. And a lot of it's trial and error based on the person that's in front of you. But those two serve as a credible starting point.
Yeah, thank you. Amazing.
I think, Vincent, my approach is to be as direct as possible and say, if something's happened in the flow of the conversation and you're trying to reset the conversation, I just acknowledge it and say, you know what, I think I said something that seemingly upset you. And I want to apologize for that. Was there something that happened there? And just, you call it out. Now that takes some courage and some confidence to do that. But how committed are you to your relationships? I want to build world-class relationships. So I'm willing to have crucial conversations along the way. If it's something that we did, that's not in alignment with our values, I'm like, darn, I missed the mark there. Right? As soon as I recognize it, I raise my hand and I say, I'm sorry. Vince, I missed the mark with you and I'd like to apologize. And what I'd like to ask for is your help. Right? My favorite words in business, which most people think is crazy, right? But it's so disarming to ask people for help because it's like, oh, now we're in this together. Great. Now I have the bridge built for us to have a conversation again. Right? And so you have to be able to go on bent knee when you have made those mistakes. Most people just try and pretend it didn't happen. Right? And you'll never recover the relationship when you just pretend things didn't happen. So if it's important to you, do the work to repair the relationship.
Awesome. Thank you.
I love it. By the way, I saw Matt Kleinrock slide in here too. And I think you were wrong because you said you can't run your business like a frat party. He kind of runs his business like a frat party and it's very successful. It's very good, but it's a lot of fun to be inside his business.
I stand corrected, Jerry.
I would just tell you this, and you've been a great guest. I always ask people that we're having on the show, let's respect our listeners' time. Let's make them think about the world a little bit differently or give them some type of actionable framework that they can use. And I will tell you, I have about a page and a half of notes because I take notes as I go. You have certainly done that here. So, Ed, let me just ask you this. I know your background's in fitness. You're super fit. You're the only guy that I personally know that gets up earlier than I do. And so I don't know exactly what time you go to bed, but 3:30 is an early start. Tell me about this whole concept of relationship fitness, why it matters and how it's done. Is it really just the culmination of all the things that you've talked about, investing in your people, knowing your people, building the trust, communicating? What is all bring that all together for us?
Fundamentally, there's one thing I would add, and that is whether it's the relationship with ourselves in whatever buckets we label fitness, whether it's physical fitness, psychological or emotional fitness, or then fitness with other people. One of the things that we have to acknowledge is we are generally really, really bad at negotiating with ourselves and very often negotiating with other people. So for example, if today I'm just not feeling good enough to go to the gym, I don't like that. I feel some type of guilt and shame in the moment, and I don't want to feel that guilt and shame in the moment. So what I do is I end up saying, you know what, I'll just go tomorrow. And I'm able to rationalize not going today because I've made a verbal commitment to myself tomorrow. I've negotiated with that. Well, it turns out, Jerry, that Fridays aren't typically a gym day for me. I've got a full slate, and it's very unlikely that I would get there. But what I did in the moment in that negotiation is I felt better about myself for having done that. And on some level, I improved the relationship with myself. But over the long period, it ultimately doesn't work because I'm a really bad manager of myself and even worse employee. with following, through on certain things. And so then you apply that to relationships with other people, in addition to everything that we've talked about. Like, let's say you and I have to have a crucial, fierce conversation. You're my manager. Well, what if you're really, really nervous about having that conversation with me because you're terrified at how I'm going to respond to that? But how you end up navigating that and negotiating with me through that, it ultimately might lead to me, trying to enter into a zero-sum game type of competition with you, and then that's win-lose, and you wanted to be more collaborative, and you have that dynamic. Of course, the opposite's true too, where I might be overly accommodating for you in that quote negotiation on working through this thing. And the challenge to me being overly accommodating is at some point it's going to dawn on me that you're winning all the time, even though I'm letting you win. And that creates the possibility for bitterness and resentment to foster, and that just undermines all of it. So we really need to look inward and figure out the ways in each area of our life. Figure out what are those things that will allow us to become a better version of ourselves today. And again, not a perfect version. Can I be like what Jordan Peterson says? It can be better today than I was yesterday. Compare myself to today versus what I was yesterday versus anybody else. And there's a lot of truth to that. And that sentiment's been around a really long time, dating back nearly 200 years. So I think that's really one of the first things leaders need to reconcile if they want to have relationally fit interactions with others.
And I think that's the goal of every leader, or it should be. And if that isn't your goal, then maybe you should stay as an individual contributor and not put people in your care. And that's okay too. You need lots of individual contributors inside organizations. And I think that's a great piece. Ed, so fun. I appreciate the heck out of you. I'm so glad we were able to finally do this. And I think it's always so humbling. I've done this show since February. I get to spend an hour every week with the smartest person that I can find that's willing to come and talk to me. And so think about how much I've grown as a person. And I appreciate you contributing to that. So thank you for that. For everyone else, listen, we're on a mission, and it's this thing right here. And I look at it 25 hours a week. I'm on a mission to positively impact 5 million people over the next 5 years through better business, because people don't show up and say, I want to suck at work. We have to do a better job as leaders to help foster that. And that's why we're here. So if you could subscribe, whatever it is, tell a friend. They should be here too, because we're going to get better together. And so if you're listening, pick up your phone, maybe send a text to someone and say, you should listen to Ed Slover. He's a really smart guy. And I thought this was a great episode. So Ed, I thank you for your time this week. Next week, last show of the year, because I'm going to go on vacation with my family, which I'm really looking forward to. And we should do that. So I'm going to close out the year reviewing all of our guests. I think we had, Maria might have this better than I think we had 39 episodes this year, plus or minus. And so I'm going to look back on all of the things that I've learned, the common themes across all of these amazing leaders, practitioners, authors that we've had on the show. And so I'd love to have you back next week. We do it live every week, except for Christmas and the week after Christmas, 3:30 Eastern time. Come have some fun with us and come tell your friends. Ed, thanks again for being here. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Jerry.